What's up, guys? Welcome back. Maverick here. Today I've got another video for you where we're walking through the different types of players you're going to encounter in Call of Duty Warzone. We're going to take a look at their play style, how they fight, what are their strengths and weaknesses, so that you can start recognizing these players on the battlefield. Now, it's important to note that just because a player is passive or aggressive or tactical doesn't mean they'll play the entire match that way. There are going to be times when the battlefield forces them to respond in a way that is not their natural cadence. This is important for you to learn to recognize, because as your skills advance, you're going to be able to start dictating how people fight you and forcing them to play in a way that isn't natural or they're uncomfortable with, which gives you the edge. Make sure you turn on notifications for when that video comes live. Today we're just going to focus on the identifying portion though. We're going to take a look at how you identify these players. We're going to see what would they naturally do throughout the course of a match. How would they naturally play throughout the course of a match as long as the battlefield allowed them to fall into what's comfortable. Let's jump into some gameplay. The first player style we're going to be talking about is the aggressive player, aka Juggernaut. Aggressive players are players that rely on their gun skill and a sense of overwhelming force to neutralize enemies. They willingly take gunfights most people would consider 50-50s, trusting in their gunplay and their enemies' panic to give them an edge. This player flourishes in squad-based game modes, but can find it difficult to survive deep into solo matches. You tend to see one, maybe two aggressive players in the endgame and solos. These players are cannibals and routinely find themselves seeking out and destroying the other aggressive players in the match. Their playstyle can be characterized by near constant movement, liberal use of their ammo and plunder, and high kill games. Aggressive players tend to sequence their match in small sequences of kills, using each kill to replenish their lost ammo, utility, and money to effectively fund the next hunt. Aggressive players are aptly described as juggernauts because the only time they seem to stop their relentless onslaught is when they're dead. These players seek out a constant supply of UAVs, dead silence, and bounty contracts. They're not afraid of gas damage and are prone to overcommitting to a fight and putting themselves in a bad situation. A typical fight with an aggro player looks like this.
Target is down. Well done.
Aggressive player strengths. Going to be their gun skill, they don't panic easily, and they stand out in the early into mid game because as they rack up kills, they gain utility advantages against their enemies. This leads to them acquiring their loadout sooner, which leads to having more confidence and better weapons earlier in matches. Speaking of loadouts, here's my recommended loadout for an aggressive player. As an aggressive player, your playstyle is characterized by speed and overwhelming force. So for an aggressive player, this is the type of loadout I'd recommend. So we've got your M4 kitted this way. The idea behind this M4 is I want a weapon that can start fights, not necessarily finish them. The idea is that if I can get a full 30 round clip on somebody out in the open, because I have a higher level of gunplay than the average player, I can kill him. But I'm typically going to be switching to my secondary gun to finish off most kills and most engagements. This is not a weapon that you frequently reload mid-fight. The recommendation is that you fire it down to the last bullet and then switch to your overkill MP7 to close out and overwhelm your opponents. That extra second is going to give you the advantage. So it's a weapon that you can start mid to long range engagements by chipping away your opponent's armor, and then you can move in for the kill with overwhelming force with the MP7. Let's take a look at the MP7. The MP7 design here is all about speed and hip fire. The entire concept behind it is that by the time you get to the point where you're using this weapon, you don't need the ADS, you're close enough to your opponent, and you just need to be putting rounds down range, and the hip fire accuracy on that is going to allow you to get, again, an extra second on your opponent, which will be making all the difference in any engagement. When you engage as an aggressive player, I want you going primary weapon to secondary weapon and shooting all your bullets essentially all the way down until you're dry completely. Let's look at your perks. Aggressive players, you want contact. The entire idea behind this is generating momentum so you're engaging as many people as possible. Speed is your friend, so we're not doing any cold-blooded. We want people to be aware of where we're at. Double time is going to, again, give us that little edge in terms of movement. And then also the crouch speed is going to be a pretty big differentiator for you to get close to enemies in a stealthy way. Overkill gives you both weapons, and then tracker is a way that you can keep track of people when you get lost in the chaos. Thermite grenade might be kind of unexpected. I like the thermite grenade because it's going to create movement in your opponents. It is also a very good counter to cars. The thermite grenade will destroy most vehicles and disable them very, very quickly, which again gives you an edge because it'll catch your opponents off guard that are coming at you with a vehicle. Going with a stun grenade for the tactical. So many people are running Ghost nowadays that I don't think the heartbeat sensor helps you, and you're not pulling up midway through the fight. So the stun grenade is going to exacerbate your movement advantage against your opponents. So anything that can slow them down, again, is all about creating timing edges for you. So anytime that they get delayed a half second and you gain a half second advantage, you're going to be winning more and more gunfights as an aggressive player. Let's talk about aggressive player weaknesses. Aggressive players tend to get tunnel vision when going for kills, and they get blindsided rushing across open spaces or not properly checking their surroundings, like this. They also tend to not focus on positioning as they transition into the in-game and can find themselves in suboptimal positions. Combine this with the fact that their mantra music or gunshots, and aggressive players tend to find themselves in a situation when they have bad positioning and everyone knows their location towards the end of solo matches. The best way to counter an aggressive player is by feigning weakness to get them to commit to rushing you, or run headlong into an unknown battle space trying to pounce on your perceived weakness. Corners are your friend, break line of sight, and mount for an easy kill to an overcommitted aggressive player. Some suggestions for aggressive players. If you're looking to stop getting 12 kill 7th places, slow down once the gulag closes. Focus on finding a dominant position for the endgame, and then turn up your gunplay and aggression to flush out the final kills. So, we've got an important context discussion to have here about Battle Royale. I think there's an important distinction that people need to understand when it comes to this genre. First, the entire point of the game is to be the last person standing. Kills are great for Instagram clips. More than one isn't necessary to win. Winning is the point of the game. Passive players tend to get a bad rap for being campers. A 15 kill win might be great for the gram, but when it comes down to your total victories or your win percentage, it's kind of the exact same as a 1 kill win. Winning is winning. A low kill win still requires a deep understanding of rotations, player movement, positioning, and trigger discipline. There are fantastic players that routinely win with less than 5 kills that I'd take in my quote-unquote Warzone fantasy league over the slew of 9 kill 23rd players out there. So let's talk about the passive player, aka the Ghost. Passive players are players that rely on movement and patience to put themselves in positions to only initiate gunfights they have an abundance of confidence they can win. They'll react when cornered, but they'd prefer to wait for the perfect engagement. These are players that can seemingly disappear mid-engagement and leave their enemies chasing their tails looking for them. They have a solid foundational understanding of how players behave and tend to weave themselves around their enemy's line of sight. Rotating is a strength for these players. The gas and them are old friends, and they have no trouble spending time together for multiple instances each match. The passive playstyle thrives in the mid and end game. You'll find most of the final 10 players in a solo match composed of passive players. Passive player strengths. rotations, player understanding, map knowledge, and patience, patience, patience. The passive player's greatest strength is their patience. They'll hold a dominant position for the length of the match if they can. This forces their enemies to engage them in a way where their enemies are at a disadvantage, or it allows their enemies to be swept up in the rest of the game flow by being third-partied or reactively engaged, which allows the passive player to disappear into that interrupted chaos. Passive player weaknesses. Passive players tend to struggle with indecisiveness in the endgame. As the zone closes in, they're caught with a slew of audio and visual cues that can slow their decision-making process and allow them to get caught in a scenario where their movement is dictated by external factors like the zone. It's this lack of flexibility that can frequently result in them getting eliminated by tactical players in the final zones taking advantage of their indecision. Passive players also find themselves frequently at a weapon or utility disadvantage. This begins in the early game because passive players are less prone to take early fights, which results in less access to legendary weapons and cash, which leads to a later acquisition of your loadout. This means that engaging a passive player with a focus on taking away what resources they have. Think of like continually breaking their armor until they run out of armor. This can put them in a scenario where the disadvantages they have are extremely difficult to overcome. Here's a look at what I think a good standard passive player loadout would be. Passive players are all about stealth optimization and using items to interrupt the game flow of their enemies. For a passive player loadout, I recommend a good all-around weapon like the M13. It needs to be structured to allow you for high degrees of accuracy and to make sure that if you start a fight, you're able to end it. So we're running 16-round clip, fully loaded, Ranger foregrip, the marksman barrel, and a monolithic suppressor. The nice thing about running fully loaded on this is that whether you get this at the end of the first circle or the fifth circle, you know you're going to be in the exact same spot every time you pick it up. In terms of the rest of the class, any good passive player class is going to have Cold-Blooded and Ghost. We're going to take Shrapnel and accompany it with 2 Claymores to allow you to better secure high-value positions. The RPG and the Gas Grenade are 2 items that most of your opponents will not expect you to have. They're either going to do massive amounts of damage that are going to kill or pull your opponent back, or with the Gas Grenade, it forces your opponent to drop out of ADS. This chaos either gives you an edge to finish a gunfight, or backs up your opponent, which gives you more time to disappear into the night. To my passive players out there, try getting a little more active in the early game to help counter the resource disparity that can ruin your chances at victory before they begin. Use your map and player knowledge to increase your early game looting to make sure that you're optimally kitted by the time the gulag closes. The final player style we're going to discuss is the tactical player, aka the operator.
Bravo 6. Going dark.
Tactical players are the chess masters of Warzone. They tend to have an average or above average mechanical skills like gun skill, but their greatest weapon is their understanding of game flow and player response. Tactical players adapt to the battlefield circumstances and are trying to direct the game flow. These are players that confuse you and are constantly changing their angle and their battlefield depth. They're apt at slowly chipping away your confidence and resources. They'll make moves and decisions, herding their enemies into bad positions or situations to take bad gunfights. Tactical players tend to have consistent representation across all game phases, so you'll typically see 2 to 3 of these players in the final 10. This tends to be the hardest player style to implement because it requires quickly interpreting the information of any given situation and then accurately determining the best battle plan. Tactical player strengths. Tactical players are good at predicting player movement and flanking or changing angles on their enemies during gunfights. They're routinely finding the best strategic position for each zone and are constantly taking advantage of enemy mistakes. Tactical player weaknesses. Tactical players can complicate fights unnecessarily and are frequently caught off guard by explosives. The tactical player assumes his enemy plays the game with the same mental acuity as himself and tends to make unnecessary movement or plays against weaker opponents. Tactical players try to predict player behavior during the course of each fight and struggle with responding to things like RPGs being used against them because it's a tool that they don't typically use. To my tactical players out there, introduce a higher level of aggression in the latter parts of the mid-game and the early parts of the end-game. These periods tend to be times during the match when player density is lower and you have a reduced chance of being third-party in engagements. If you get an advantage on a player, push forward and overwhelm them. Also, EOD is your friend. Here's a look at a tactical player loadout. The tactical player wants to be able to cover any type of gunfight, respond or initiate any type of gunfight, which means you're covering the entire range spectrum. I recommend an overkill sniper class with an SMG. Go with the sniper you're most comfortable with. I prefer the AX-150 and a variable zoom scope. This again allows me to have high pinpoint accuracy at long distance and still be able to utilize the weapon in mid-range engagements if I need to crack somebody's shield or I need a headshot to neutralize an enemy that has an advantage against me. The sniper build is all about accuracy, not about mobility. Don't worry about ADS speed or anything of that nature. I'm not using it to quickscope. I'm going to have it up and down sight 9 times out of 10 before the person ever enters my viewpoint. Next up, we got the AUG. This AUG is a marksman build without sacrificing too much mobility. We're running the 5.56 NATO drum, a stippled grip tape, the Merc foregrip to assist if we have to hip fire a little bit, and we've got the long barrel and the monolithic suppressor. Don't really need a sight. The iron sight's pretty strong on the AUG. This is a good weapon to cover both mid and short range engagements. In terms of perks, we're running with cold-blooded to counter any thermal, specifically thermal snipers. We've got our overkill setup. We're also using tracker. I like to use tracker and heartbeat sensor. Those are two items that are going to give us information that allows us to plan our attack against opponents. C4 is a good all-around explosive device. It's also something that we can use to set traps as we force opponents into a certain space and use it to get an edge in the gunfight. There you have it, guys. We've got an overview of the different playstyles, ways to characterize each playstyle, and even some tips on how to improve if you're one of these players that are tactical, passive, or aggressive. Over the course of this series, we're going to be walking through drop locations, loot runs, loadouts, ways to counter each playstyle throughout the course of a match. So make sure you're subscribed and you've got notifications turned on. To anybody out there that's ever felt like me, a little bit of a misfit, out of place, maybe a black sheep, just know that you've got a home in this community. To the rest of my misfits, take care.